Ready or not, it is almost time for another round of elections in Connecticut. September 13th is primary day for cities and towns. And if you want to vote and aren't registered, there is a deadline fast approaching. Here to talk about the races and some changes to our voting process, perhaps, Secretary of State Denise Merrill. Thanks, Denise, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So primary day is in just about a week from now. And what are the deadlines for getting involved?
Well, you can register to vote right up through September 12th if you are unaffiliated or not registered at all.
Okay.
This is a party primary, so you have to be, if it's a Republican primary, you have to be a Republican. If it's a Democratic primary, you have to be a Democrat.
Do you expect, we were talking about how the events of, surrounding Hurricane Irene, certainly people are spending a lot of time reaching out to their first selectmen, their councils, as everybody tries to get power and such back on. Never a better time to know who's in charge.
Exactly. This is a very important election. And I think, history tells us that people tend not to vote as much in local elections.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because that's where people really affect your life. And we are seeing it right today.
And so how many, I have a list, how many primaries are there?
There's about 20 throughout the state. Some of them tend to kind of evaporate at the last minute sometimes. But right now there's about 20.
What is the participation level usually?
Well, we're lucky to hit 20% in some cases. Depends on if it's a really hot race. Sometimes a lot of people will show up, but generally we have pretty low turnout.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, so you're trying to make some efforts, though, to change the percentage and also to make it more convenient in a lot of different ways. You recently held a voting technology fair, and you've also formed this task force. Tell me what your mission is.
Well, I think we need to bring our election system into the 21st century. Mm-hmm. And I say that because we see voter participation dropping. And we're still doing elections the same way we were 50, 100 years ago, with people crossing off hand lists. And that's just not the way people do business these days. So we'd like to make it an easier system for people to navigate.
It's surprising that you say that participation is dropping, because it seems as if people are more politically minded. There's so many cable shows that are dedicated purely to politics.
But it doesn't translate into voting, and that is the disappointment. It's really, people still feel, my vote doesn't really count. Mm-hmm. You hear that all the time, and it can't be more untrue.
Right.
It really is just not the case. Your vote counts.
So what sorts of things are you looking at?
Well, we're looking at new technologies. For example, we've been talking to people like Google about having a Google app. So you have your iPhone or smartphone, and you'd be able to put in your name and figure out where your polling place is, who's on your ballot, and when the elections are, that type of thing.
Yeah, that makes it very easy.
Yeah, and we're doing a lot of things to look at the way we're doing actual election process at the local level. I'd like to see us have an online voter registration database, by the end of next year, where you could register to vote right online.
Why is that not? That seems like a no-brainer. Why is that not already in place?
Because our election laws are kind of behind the times, and we still have a system of 169 towns where the registrar registers you at the local town hall, and you have to go down in person. A lot of it has to do with how do you prove you are who you are. And
well, that's true.
A lot of wrangling about that.
But registering is one thing. When you actually have to show up at the poll, you would have to show that you are who you are.
Sure.
Right.
And even when you register, there are ways to check, and that's what local registrars would still do. They would still send out something to you to make sure you're who you are, say you are, and where you live, where you say you live.
Who's the opposition coming from? In terms of getting online voting?
It's not really opposition. It's the same old thing. It's like inertia.
Yeah.
I would say. And Connecticut isn't exactly, called the land of steady habits for nothing. It's very difficult to change, and it costs money. New technology. Not very much, honestly, but, to get things like electronic poll books where you just scan it in with a little wand and off you go to vote. That kind of thing, which seems really simple. But it's all paid for and done at the local level, so you have to talk all towns into doing it at the same time.
Which I can imagine is a feat in itself. Is there data supporting that online registration results in more voting?
Well, that's interestingly difficult to find out because there's very little data on any kind of election process. We just don't know much about our election system in the end, which is interesting because it's the one that's probably most important to our democracy.
Right. And you're also pushing for a constitutional amendment to allow early voting. Explain that.
Yes. Right now, we have a kind of an unusual situation in Connecticut where in our Constitution, it says you have to show up on Election Day, essentially, with 4 exceptions. So usually that's done in statute in in most states. So we'd like to take that language out of, so we can experiment a little bit with some of these newer methods. And we can't do that right now until we take it to the people.
But people absentee vote. They send in absentee votes.
That's one of the, only if you are going to be completely absent from the jurisdiction from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., or if you're completely disabled, or I think there's a religious exemption. So there are very narrow exceptions. And more, what people are doing is they're just getting an absentee ballot anyway and just basically saying they're not going to be there.
How early, if you were to design this, how early would you want people to be able to vote?
Well, that's what we're looking at right now. In places like Florida, they've gone up to 10 days, I think it is. So you'd have 10 days to vote, and they open only certain polling places. Some states have experimented with things like Saturday election, so you'd just be able to vote either Saturday or the day of the election. But, people have talked for years about why isn't it a holiday of some kind, that it's really limiting for people who have to go to work early in the morning.
Are there other states that have early voting?
Oh, yeah. That is about 15 states now. And then you have states like Oregon, which is completely mail-in voting. There is no election day anymore in Oregon.
Do you know what their participation rates are? Are they
much higher?
Really?
Yes.
So
people love it.
So this is just you're in the planning stages, or
right? Well, we'd really like to do some research. I don't see change for change's sake.
Right.
I do think we have to make it easier for people. I think we have to keep up with the times. But, I don't think we should go into this without knowing what other states have done and what it looks like and, which one we want to follow.
What's interesting, though, is, as you know, the last week of an election there can be bombs dropped. All sorts of things can happen.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if you have someone voting 10 days before and then they want to change their vote,
No, there's a lot of interesting research on this. And in fact, we heard about it the other day from the fellow who was here from the National Voting Center. And it's interesting that people who tend to vote early tend to be the ones who are pretty sure they know what they're going to do.
Right.
And so that, they're not the ones that are going to be changing their minds.
Right.
It's almost like you're casting your vote saying, no matter what happens, I'm with this person.
Are you getting, or do you want public input if people say, well, I'd like to have my 2 cents on this? What should they do?
Oh, well, it will go to the voters.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to change the Constitution is a long process. So we have to get a 3/4 vote from the General Assembly. Then it has to go on the ballot in 2012. And so everyone will get a chance to put in their 2 cents on this one. That's for sure.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I think people want to know about voting, and it'd be interesting to see if it has an effect.
Most voters are very supportive of this idea. They're feeling like, that they want it to be a more modern system. And, there's so much more mobility now. So
right.
I think we'll get some success.
Thanks a lot for being here, Denise.
Sure.
Don't forget, if you missed something here on The Real Story, you can now watch it online by going to ctnow.com. You can also catch us on YouTube. Thanks for watching this week's edition of The Real Story. We'll see you here again next week.